Nityanandam. This is Kailasa's official response to anti-Hindu deep state media CNBC News 18's hate speech and genocidal campaign against all Hindu diaspora. The fundamental questions that News 18 must answer. Dear anti-Hindu deep state media News 18 operatives, before addressing your systematic hate speech campaign, we demand clarity on these urgent questions. Who authorized your global jurisdiction? By what authority do you interfere in legitimate diplomatic relations between US Hindus and indigenous Bolivian communities? On what legal basis do you presume to be the judge, jury, and executioner in matters of international law and indigenous rights? And why are you involving the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism when he is not even a signatory? The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism has not signed agreements with indigenous Bolivian communities, and nowhere has even proclaimed that the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism is involved in these agreements. These agreements are between US Hindus affiliated with a legitimate humanitarian organization and sovereign indigenous nations in Bolivia. Why do you persist in misattributing these agreements to the SPH? Why are you launching an incendiary, genocidal attack against all Hindu diaspora? Your systematic targeting strongly implies that all Hindus worldwide have no right to exist, to practice their faith, or to establish humanitarian partnerships. This is not mere slander, it is a direct incitement of mob violence and continuing the historical patterns of Hindu genocide. Why the deliberate conflation of separate legal entities? The agreements were executed by a US-based humanitarian organization entirely independent of the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism or any other entity. By merging the two, you expose your malicious and premeditated intent to demonize Hindus. And to ask the real question, who funds the corrupt media, News 18's anti-Hindu persecution campaigns? Which anti-Hindu deep state backers sponsor your repeated broadcasts that brand entire Hindu communities as fraudulent or fictitious or illegitimate? Why do you insist that no Hindu diaspora anywhere has the right to live peacefully? Your broadcasts and articles labeled falsely as exposes of a so-called land scam systematically misrepresent a sovereign indigenous nation, legitimate diplomatic dialogues, and broad-based humanitarian efforts. This is not mere defamation, it is a persecution, lawfare, slander, and incitement to genocide targeting all Hindus worldwide. Your coverage telegraphs one horrifying message: Hindus have no right to exist and no right to engage in international cooperation. There are systematic violations that incite violence against Hindus from your anti-Hindu media corporation. As mouthpieces of these anti-Hindu deep state, you have shed every resemblance of journalistic ethics to orchestrate a premeditated persecution campaign against the entire Hindu diaspora. Your genocidal intent, demonizing Hindus as fraudulent or fictitious, is a well-worn tactic historically deployed before large-scale violence. By labeling an indigenous community as non-existent, you have laid the groundwork for denying them the right to live. Your inflammatory language suggesting Hindus as land traffickers or fraudsters is a direct invitation to mobs to attack the Hindu communities across the globe, and this has happened and happening as we speak today. You conjure false links between the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism and agreements he never signed and has no legal involvement in, and this is a deliberate falsification from your side. Your coverage singularly targets Hindu religious institutions while other faiths receive no such scrutiny or demeaning commentary. This reveals your religious discrimination and bigotry. And of course, the denial of indigenous agencies by showing Hindu diaspora organizations and Bolivian indigenous representatives as incapable of legitimate agreements. You peddle colonial myths that indigenous communities can be easily duped. You thus deny both the groups the inherent capacity to self-governance. And of course, your refusal to seek or publish comments from the actual signatories before airing such sensationalizing accusations exemplifies an intentional agenda to inflame hatred, further suggesting you believe Hindus do not deserve any fair platform at all. And now coming to your allegations, addressing your false allegations step by step. Your first allegation, which says, bold land grab, your repeated reference to scams are nothing but hate speech inciting violence. These agreements are standard diplomatic partnerships, formal engagements between US-based Hindu humanitarian organizations and indigenous Bolivian nations for cultural exchange, conservation, and sustainable development, none which involve the Supreme Point of Hinduism. And this has even been given in the Bolivian law in the Articles 30 and 403 of the Bolivian Constitution and many other articles in the Bolivian Constitution. It protects the indigenous communities the right to self-determination, territoriality, and their own institutions. Why should the constitutional rights exclude Hindu communities or any indigenous community from entering into the cooperation agreements? Your attack is not an attack on Kailasa, it is an attack on the Bolivian constitution itself. Internationally recognized indigenous rights, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, Article 36, explicitly affirms the right to indigenous groups to maintain and develop contracts, relations, and cooperations with other peoples across borders. Calling such relationships as bizarre or scams is a blatant assault on the rights of indigenous people and international law. These agreements are conservation and not land grabs. All partnership agreements contain explicit clauses ensuring compliance with Bolivian law and community oversight. They focus on sustainable practices, reforestation, environmental protection, cultural preservation, and the goals which are enshrined in the Bolivian law and in the charters of the indigenous nations. Your second allegations, which say deceptive 1,000-year agreements, News 18's claims that these native communities can be so easily misled is a reversion to colonizer thinking, assuming indigenous peoples lack agency and free will. And just for your knowledge, these negotiations were transparent. The process included thorough community consultation, the free prior informed consent, legal vetting, and group discussions. The agreements were not single signature deals, they had multiple signatories from both governing bodies. And these agreements are shared cultural and environmental values. Many Andean communities hold spiritual traditions resonant with Hindu perspectives on environmental preservation and cosmic harmony. These deeply compatible frameworks fostered these agreements with the Bolivian indigenous nations. Your third allegation, which says self-proclaimed and Kailasa has no recognized territory or international legitimacy. News 18 frequently calls Kailasa non-existence, ignoring the denial of self-determination rights. Characterizing Kailasa as fictitious violates the fundamental right of indigenous Hindu communities to define themselves, recognized under international law. If other faith communities can form enclaves or spiritual nations, why must Hindus be denied? Kailasa also complies with the Montevideo Convention, and Kailasa meets the recognized criteria for statehood under the Montevideo Convention, having a permanent population, defined territory, a government, and capacity to enter into international relations. And of course, this Montevideo Convention also is not a recognition by third parties. It is not a prerequisite for existence, which is there in the Article 3 and 13 of the Montevideo Convention itself. Kailasa is a continuation of centuries-old indigenous Hindu traditions. To dismiss it outright is a genocidal erasure of an entire people, an entire civilization. Your fourth allegation, which says 3 times the size of New Delhi for 1,000 years, painting this land grab, is a deliberate distortion of long-term conversion partnerships. Indigenous groups routinely use multi-generational timelines for land conservation. The global best practices often extend 50, 100, 500 years for environmental agreements. 1,000 years is not audacious, but is a reflection of deep ecological commitments to indigenous nations that have stood and will stand for thousands of years. And these agreements have thorough respect for Bolivian legal structures. The agreements specify that this will be effectuated after ratification by the competent authorities, ensuring the oversight of the whole Bolivian national law. And of course, the Bolivian indigenous constitutional rights, Article 403 of the Bolivian Constitution, grants indigenous communities the right to maintain and develop their own forms of economic, cultural, and spiritual life. These long-term agreements are completely aligned with that vision. The allegation 5, which says fugitive accused in a case of sexual assault, a standard anti-Hindu trope that has been repeatedly disproven in the courts. The Supreme Court of Hinduism has never been convicted of any crime. Let me repeat, has never been convicted of any crime. And after a decade of trials and investigations, courts worldwide, including in the United States, have exonerated him in the very allegations that your racist anti-Hindu media keep repeating. In the United States, the same false accuser was penalized nearly $500,000 in defamation damages. In multiple Indian High Courts and Supreme Court rulings, the Supreme Court of Hinduism's innocence has been reinforced, and his unlawful arrest has been labeled illegal or without jurisdiction. And of course, there's a scientific aspect to this also. The SPH's documented medical and forensics examinations indicate a psychological impossibility of even committing such alleged crimes, which News 18 actively suppresses these scientific facts. And also, let us come to the international organizations like Interpol. Interpol refused to issue any notice against the Supreme Court of Hinduism, and Interpol's refusals, it highlights the universal recognition of the Supreme Court of Hinduism's exoneration as per the principles of res judicata. Of course, you do not know international law, so let me take a moment to explain to you what res judicata is. Res judicata is a fundamental principle of international law, meaning a matter already judged. The same has been recognized in the Indian courts, United States courts, and the courts all over the world, in customary international law all over the world. And even the United Nations consider res judicata a common principle of international law. The Supreme Court of Hinduism has already been exonerated in the courts in the United States. The United States judiciary has established the Supreme Court of Hinduism's innocence almost over 10 years ago, and has penalized the false rape accusation nearly $500,000 in defamation, and for making false accusations against the Supreme Court of Hinduism. This has been, you can refer to the United States District Court, Southern District of Ohio, case number CV00526. And the total damage ordered by the US courts against the false accuser of rape and associated media entities have exceeded over $7 million for making false accusations of rape against the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism. And of course, we should also understand that the US judicial system consistently ranks higher in international assessments of the rule of law compared to Indian or any other system. When a matter has been adjudicated and a final judgment has been rendered in one court, other courts of other jurisdictions are obligated to respect and uphold the judgment as per the doctrine of res judicata. So clearly, unlike your anti-Hindu allegations, your racist, your hate speech against the Supreme Court of Hinduism, the Supreme Court of Hinduism time and again has been proven innocent and completely exonerated from all the crimes that you falsely keep perpetrating to incite genocide, hatred, hate speech, and discrimination against a whole international community. Let us now go to your next allegation. Accused in a separate case of sexual assault and child abduction. On the 2nd of February 2024, the Gujarat High Court exonerated the Supreme Court of Hinduism of all false charges of abduction and kidnapping in the case number RCSR 9973 of 2019. The key points from the court order says that the court directly interacted with the woman who falsely portrayed by the media as a kidnapped and took steps to independently verify their well-being and freedom. The court unanimously concluded and stated that the court is satisfied that both are adults, mature enough to understand their well-being, and apparently are happy at the place where they're presently proceeding and on their spiritual path. Not only that, but they had also indicated that they're out of their free will and residing and have continued to reside and follow their spiritual path which they consciously intend to follow. Additionally, the court stated that there was no evidence of illegal confinement or duress. The interaction with the corpora would indicate that they were not in any way illegally confined. The court found the same to be reliable, is unable to conclude that the corpora are in any manner in duress or influence. Finally, the court conclusively legally vindicated the Supreme Court of Hinduism, formally dismissing the false and nefarious allegations of abduction and kidnapping. Quoting the Honorable High Court directly, the Honorable High Court said that in view of the aforesaid, the court deems it fit to discharge the notice and dismiss the petition accordingly. The findings by the Gujarat Honorable High Court conclusively demonstrate that the allegations of kidnapping or abduction were false, baseless, vexatious, and without merit. At the time of the alleged incident, the Supreme Court of Hinduism was not even in Gujarat, and this information communicated to you in February 2024 and received by your Legal and Grievances Department. It is your duty to retract and rectify such hate speech, racist hate speech, misinformation, or face the consequences or the contempt of High Court orders. In your next allegation, it says that its representatives were arrested and deported and its land deals nullified. Your breaking news segments about deportations and arrests are pure fiction. No deportations, no arrests. The so-called legal actions reported by News 18 never occurred. No official Bolivian channel confirmed any such event. In fact, these alleged arrests of the 20 Kailasa operatives are unsubstantiated fabrications and repeated to generate shock headlines. And the legitimate engagement with the Bolivian communities, the actual signatories remain in good standing with the local Bolivian authorities. The confusion arises purely from your manufactured hate speech narrative to inflame hostility and degrade the standing of Hindu communities. In your next allegation, you say fleeing India in 2019. For over the past 15 years, the Supreme Court of Hinduism has been persecuted, illegally arrested, and defamed. Repeated false charges, withheld evidence, and malicious prosecutions are well documented. The courts in both India and the United States have repeatedly noted the glaring misconduct. You also say that the Supreme Court of Hinduism has been fleeing, yet you should actually know the persecution that was done to the Supreme Court of Hinduism. The Supreme Court of Hinduism's passport was arbitrarily seized illegally, rendering him effectively stateless. All of these are media trials and witch hunts. Outlets like your CNBC News 18 conduct a parallel trial, ignoring court orders and manufacturing stories without verifying facts. Our demand for immediate retraction, an apology that News 18 must cease and desist from publishing or broadcasting any further defamatory content relating to the Supreme Court of Hinduism or Kailasa, and publish a complete apology for your systematic hate speech, religious bigotry, and genocidal commentary against the Hindu diaspora, and retract all inflammatory allegations across digital, print, and broadcast platforms, including your repeated false claims about land grabs, deportations, arrests, and other unverified narratives. We call upon the international community to hold such of these anti-Hindu racist media to follow the journalistic ethics and not incite genocide on such minority communities like the indigenous people and the Hindu minority communities. And we call upon the international community to prevent the further dissemination of hate speech and to ensure factual reporting on the indigenous Hindu communities and the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism. Thank you. Nityanandam.